Marvin Gaye revealed the 5 artists he couldn't stand working with. Imagine stepping into a studio filled with smoke, silence, and tension so thick you could slice it. The air is heavy not with anger, but with truth that no one dares to speak. On one side of the glass stands Marvin Gaye, cigarette in hand, eyes half closed. On the other, Diana Ross, flawless, controlled, commanding. They don't speak. They don't look at each other. They just sing. Separately. In the same room, yet galaxies apart. This wasn't a tabloid feud. It was deeper, more silent, more dangerous. Because for Marvin, music was never about money, power, or popularity. It was survival. It was the last refuge for a black man drowning in expectations, contracts, and applause that never truly heard his pain. Marvin didn't just sing soul, he bled it. And that made collaboration near impossible with anyone who didn't treat the mic like a lifeline. There were 5 names, 5 legends, icons the world bowed to. But Marvin couldn't stand being in the same room with them because they represented everything he fought against: control, perfectionism, performance without pain. Diana Ross, David Ruffin, Norman Whitfield, Berry Gordy, and Quincy Jones. Titans in their own right, yet to Marvin, each embodied a different prison. He clashed with Berry Gordy not because he hated authority, but because Gordy wanted hits and Marvin wanted healing. He distanced himself from Norman Whitfield not for lack of respect, but because Whitfield composed like a scientist while Marvin created like a man on fire. Quincy Jones. Marvin admired him, but walked away from a dream collab because he didn't believe music should be that clean. And David Ruffin. Too much ego, too much show. They were mirrors of each other's pain, and that's what hurt the most. But perhaps the most tragic was Diana Ross. Their voices were divine together, but never in sync. Because she needed structure and he needed space. She rehearsed. He improvised. She demanded perfection. He wanted release. They didn't fight. They just couldn't breathe the same artistic air. In a world where every collaboration is hyped, every feature celebrated, Marvin did the unthinkable. He said no. No to producers, no to perfection, no to the industry's golden formula. And in doing so, he risked everything: money, fame, even friendships. But what he created instead was timeless, revolutionary, real. This isn't a gossip story. It's a story of a man who chose authenticity over comfort and solitude over compromise. Because sometimes to protect your soul, you have to walk away from those who mean the most, even if they're legends. And that's exactly what Marvin Gaye did. Stay tuned, because in the next chapters we'll step deeper into these 5 stories, unfiltered, unforgettable, and still echoing through the history of soul music. Marvin Pentz, Gaye Jr., entered the world on April 2, 1939, in a cramped 2-story brick row house on 1st Street, SW, Washington, D.C. A neighborhood so poor, locals joked that even stray dogs kept moving. His father, Reverend Marvin Gaye Sr., presided over the Rigid House of God sect, a storefront congregation where Saturday services often stretched past midnight, and children were expected to pray louder than their hunger. His mother, Alberta Cooper Gaye, worked sunrise to sundown as a domestic folding strangers' linen so her own children could eat supper. Within those tight walls, Marvin's earliest memories were the smell of starch, the sting of a leather strap, and the electrifying swell of gospel voices rising from the sanctuary below their apartment. Life under Reverend Gaye was equal parts scripture and terror. The Reverend condemned secular music as sin, yet beat his son for missing a note in a hymn. Marvin later confessed that he sang in perfect pitch, not from talent alone, but because a wrong chord could get you whipped. By age 8, he could harmonize complex quartets, lead devotionals, and mimic the falsetto of Clara Ward with uncanny precision. But every hallelujah carried a bruise. When the Reverend wasn't preaching, he prowled the house in women's clothing, a secret Marvin had to guard, and lashed out whenever his authority felt threatened. To escape, Marvin rebuilt a battered radio he found in a trash heap, then hid beneath the bed covers each night, absorbing everything from Mahalia Jackson to Nat King Cole. Cole's smooth baritone felt like forbidden fruit, luxurious urbane worlds apart from the rigid church cadences. Marvin practiced for hours trying to blend Cole's velvet with the raw conviction of the pulpit. The seed of his singular voice, formal yet aching, was planted in that midnight cocoon. In 1956, craving distance from fists and fire and brimstone, 17-year-old Marvin dropped the E from his last name, echoing Sam Cooke's chic reinvention, and enlisted in the Air Force. The uniform promised dignity, but military life felt like trading one tyranny for another. After clashing with superiors, he faked mental illness to secure an honorable discharge, then hurried back to D.C. with nothing but a tenor sax, a cardboard suitcase, and a dream no church could cage. He joined the Rainbow's a doo-wop quintet that rehearsed in alleyways lit only by cigarette tips. Their street corner harmonies earned a regional buzz and, more importantly, introduced Marvin to the intoxicating democracy of group singing where voices shared space instead of battling for it. In 1959, guitarist-producer Bo Diddley heard them, renamed them the Marquis, and cut sides for OK Records. Sales fizzled, but the sessions blew open. Marvin's imagination, amplifiers, tape reels, arrangements, tools for sculpting sound into feeling. That same year, Harvey Fuqua baritone of Chicago's famed Moonglows recruited the Marquis as his new backing lineup. Marvin became the group's unofficial arranger, adding jazz chords and gospel flourishes that startled veteran engineers at Chess Studios. Sleeping on basement floors, he learned to read lead sheets, tune drums, and overdub handclap skills that would later make him Motown's secret weapon. In 1960, Fuqua moved his protégés to Detroit, the boomtown of gleaming Chevrolets and even shinier hits. Berry Gordy, a former assembly line worker with the charisma of a prizefighter, had just incubated Tamla Records in a West Grand Boulevard house, famously nicknamed Hitsville, USA. Gordy saw two assets in Marvin, a drummer with impeccable timing and a crooner who could woo both supper club patrons and teenage sock-hop dancers. Marvin, meanwhile, saw Gordy as a doorway to the polished supper club stardom of Nat King Cole. His first Tamla release, the jazz-leaning, the soulful moods of Marvin Gaye, 1961 bombed club owners weren't booking unknown black balladeers in tuxedos, and teenagers found candlelight standards square. Undeterred, Gordy shoved Marvin behind a drum kit, where he pounded the backbeat on Martha and the Vandellas' Stubborn Kind of Fellow and the Marvelettes' Beechwood 4-5-7-8-9. Each session toughened his rhythmic instincts and chipped away at his resistance to pop. Then came soul's irresistible call and response. Gordy paired Marvin with songwriter-arranger William Mickey Stevenson and lyricist George Gordy, cooking up Stubborn Kind of Fellow, 1962, a swaggering plea that let Marvin loosen his tie and testify. It cracked Billboard's R&B Top 10 and recast him not as a velvet crooner but as a man who could shout and sigh within the same measure. Follow-ups: Hitchhike and Pride and Joy. Both 1963 barreled up the charts, and suddenly Marvin was Motown royalty, touring on the company's revved-up Motortown Revue bus, sharing stages with Stevie Wonder and the Supremes, rehearsing dance steps in Gordy's basement at 2 a.m. until sweat slicked the floor. Success braided itself with family complications. In 1963, Marvin married Anna Gordy Berry's older sister, after a secretive courtship that blurred the line between romance and corporate alliance. Anna, 14 years his senior, became wife confidant and sometime mother figure, nurturing the wounded child beneath his suave stage persona. But their union also tethered Marvin tighter to Motown's hierarchy. Berry was now both boss and brother-in-law, blurring professional disagreements with holiday dinner tensions. The birth of Marvin III, christened Frankie after Marvin's brother in 1966, offered joy, yet amplified the stakes. Every hit now paid for, diapers every flop threatened the household. Marvin responded by working harder than any artist on the roster, cutting duets with Mary Wells, Together, 1964. Kim Weston, It Takes Two, 1966, and most famously, Tammy Terrell. When 21-year-old Tammy collapsed into Marvin's arms on stage in Virginia in 1967, the first symptom of the brain tumor that would claim her life. Marvin's world fissured. Their duet singles, Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Your Precious Love, If I Could Build My Whole World Around You weren't just hits. They were dialogues between equals, Marvin's velvet baritone cushioning Tammy's bell-like alto. Her sudden illness hurled him into depression. He secluded himself, grew a beard, questioned the value of fame, and flirted with joining the Detroit Lions to feel real pain instead of this numbness. Those months of grief would later surface as the aching vulnerability of what's going on, but in this foundational era they served as his first existential reckoning. In late 1967, Marvin reluctantly recorded I Heard It Through the Grapevine, a Norman Whitfield Barrett Strong composition already cut by Gladys Knight and the Pips. Marvin's version was darker, moody strings, minor key, Wurlitzer a vocal that sounded less jealous lover than haunted narrator. Gordy shelved it for a year, fearing it was too weird. When released in October 1968, it became Motown's biggest single to date, selling over 4 million copies and coronating Marvin as the label's first solo megastar. Ironically, the triumph deepened his dissatisfaction. If a song he believed was too raw could top the charts, why keep obeying formulas at all? By 1969, the cracks widened. The Vietnam War raged, civil rights leaders fell to assassins' bullets, and American streets burned. Marvin's brother Frankie wrote home about body bags and racist officers. Police brutality in Detroit spilled across his TV. Yet Motown still wanted love songs. Marvin now saw the assembly line he once admired as a velvet shackle. He refused interviews, skipped rehearsals, and spent dawn hours at home pounding out rough sketches that blended gospel lament with jazz progressions. Producers grumbled. Sales reps panicked. Gordy reminded him, "Protest records don't sell." But the kid who once hid under blankets with a radio had outgrown obedience. He studied Miles Davis' Sly Stone and the nascent ecology movement sculpting lyrics that asked not for romance but for mercy. Mother, mother, everybody thinks we're wrong, but who are they to judge us? The distance between that question and his father's belt felt at once infinite and intimate. By the winter of 1970, Marvin parked outside Hitsville in a beige Lincoln snow, dusting the windshield, clutching demo reels that no one had requested. Inside the lobby, he hesitated. To walk through those doors meant either surrender, another cheerful duet, another tuxedo photo shoot, or rebellion. The choice was existential remain Motown's crown jewel, or become something undefined, possibly unmarketable, but undeniably honest. He turned the ignition off, gathered his reels, and walked in. A decade earlier, he'd arrived in Detroit as a hungry session drummer. Now he entered as an artist on the verge of redefining soul music and himself. The boy born between hymns and fear was ready to confront the world beyond First Street, beyond Hitsville, beyond even the limits of a pop song. He was about to ask a wounded nation, what's going on that crossroad where trauma talent and unflinching conscience collide marks the end of Marvin Gaye's foundational journey. In the next chapter, we'll witness how that courageous pivot transformed a gifted singer into a revolutionary voice forever altering the soundscape of American music. Marvin Gaye's ascension. From starched suits to soul prophet. In the pop-obsessed, hit-hungry halls of Motown, few artists rose the way Marvin Gaye did, not by chasing trends, but by outgrowing them. His ascent to fame wasn't a straight shot to the top. It was a slow, smoldering burn, a journey marked by inner resistance, divine instinct, and an almost unbearable tension between the commercial and the spiritual. Marvin didn't just rise, he transformed. And in doing so, he changed the very idea of what a black male artist could be. By the mid-1960s, Marvin Gaye had become the man Motown paraded proudly in suits, ties, and controlled smiles. With a voice as smooth as satin, he could swing from a gritty growl to an angelic falsetto without missing a note. Radio adored him. Women screamed for him. Executives trusted him. Hits like Can I Get a Witness, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You and I'll Be Doggone showcased a master performer playing precisely within the lanes Berry Gordy designed: charming, accessible, non-threatening. Motown was more than a label, it was an empire. Gordy envisioned it as an assembly line for black excellence, polishing raw talent into superstardom. Marvin was its crown prince, the prototype of the crossover black man. He appeared regularly on American Bandstand, wore tailored tuxedos, and could croon ballads that pleased both the Harlem crowd and suburban white America. But inside, Marvin was crumbling. He once confessed that every time he put on one of those silk suits, it felt like armor fashioned not to express himself, but to protect his vulnerability. He loved the stage, but hated what it demanded, smiling through sorrow, dancing while grieving, crooning, when all he wanted to do was scream. If Marvin's solo work established his fame, it was the duets that immortalized his voice. First with Mary Wells, then Kim Weston, but the most iconic pairing was with Tammy Terrell. Their chemistry was otherworldly. Ain't no mountain high enough, ain't nothing like the real thing. You're all I need to get by. These were not just duets. They were love letters set to rhythm, tender and exhilarating. But behind the melodies was a heartbreaking reality. Tammy suffered from a series of health crises, eventually diagnosed as a brain tumor. Marvin, who had always seen her as a sister and soulmate in music, was devastated. On stage in 1967, she collapsed into his arms mid-performance, and from that moment forward, he was never quite the same. Her slow deterioration broke something in him. After her death in 1970, Marvin withdrew from the spotlight, slipping into depression, questioning the entire purpose of fame. "She was the only person in this business I truly trusted," he said. "When she died, so did the joy in my music." But that grief didn't silence him. It redefined him. Marvin's growing disillusionment with Motown's formula began colliding with a world spiraling into unrest. The 1960s were ending in fire and funerals. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The Vietnam War. Police beatings of unarmed black men. Protesters being clubbed on TV. And still Motown wanted bubblegum love songs. The more Marvin saw, the more he couldn't unsee. He heard the confusion in his brother Frankie's voice, recently returned from Vietnam, hollow-eyed, traumatized. He saw neighborhoods burning in Detroit. He watched politicians preach unity while orchestrating systemic brutality. And still executives said, keep it light, keep it safe, keep it sellable. This was the final straw. Marvin had been climbing a staircase toward stardom for years, but he realized that at the top wasn't freedom. It was a gilded prison. So he stepped off the stairwell and walked into uncharted space. In 1970, Marvin approached Motown with a concept, an album that wasn't about love or dancing, but about injustice, war, climate change, and spiritual crisis. Berry Gordy was appalled. "No one wants protest songs," he barked. "This isn't marketable." But Marvin didn't flinch. He had already produced the title track, What's Going On himself, calling in jazz musicians, layering ambient sounds, letting saxophone solos bleed over street noise and children's laughter. It was a sonic revolution. With unrelenting pressure, Marvin issued an ultimatum: release the song, or I won't record anything else for Motown again. Reluctantly, Gordy relented. The single dropped in January 1971, and it exploded. What's Going On shot to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. But more than that, it ignited a cultural awakening. Black radio hadn't heard a voice like this, so soft yet so stern, so beautiful yet so broken. Marvin didn't just sing to his fans, he pleaded with them. Talk to me so you can see. What's going on? The full album followed in May 1971. 9 tracks. 35 minutes. But it rewrote music history. What's Going On was more than a musical masterpiece. It was a manifesto. It asked questions America didn't want to answer. Why are the skies polluted? Why are veterans sleeping on the streets? Why are children dying? Why is no one listening? Despite minimal promotion from Motown, the album went platinum. Critics hailed it as a watershed moment in pop music. Marvin had done what no other soul artist dared: fuse political consciousness with mainstream appeal. He had become more than a hitmaker. He was now a prophet with a mic. But success came at a cost. Marvin had openly challenged Berry Gordy, the same man who had built his career. Their relationship grew icier. Gordy saw Marvin's independence as betrayal. Marvin saw Gordy's restraint as spiritual death. He once said working with Gordy was like dreaming someone else's dream. I was dying quietly inside until I started dreaming for myself. If what's going on was Marvin's mind crying out, "Let's get it on," was his body finally exhaling. Released in 1973, it was drenched in sensuality. From the sultry title track to the tender "Come Get to This," Marvin redefined sexual liberation not as vulgarity, but as sacred vulnerability. His vocals weren't just seductive. They were trembling confessions of longing, faith, and need. The album became one of Motown's biggest commercial successes. It went platinum. Marvin became a sex symbol almost overnight. Women adored him. Men envied him. The media dubbed him the Prince of Motown. But behind the silk robes and open shirts, Marvin was still wrestling with demons. Fame had returned, but freedom was still elusive. He was admired but misunderstood. He had proven he could create a political masterpiece and a sexual one. But Marvin didn't want to be boxed in as either saint or sinner. He wanted to keep exploring every corner of his heart, every note of the human experience. By the mid-1970s, Marvin's career entered both its most creative and chaotic phase. He released I Want You 1976, a shimmering, groove-heavy album soaked in eroticism and longing, inspired by his romance with Janice Hunter, his future second wife. Songs like After the Dance and Soon I'll Be Loving You Again were deeply sensual yet underlined by fragility. Marvin was never just a lover. He was a man begging not to be left alone. Then came Here, My Dear 1978, arguably his most personal album. Written as part of a court settlement to pay alimony to Anna Gordy, it was supposed to be a throwaway. Instead, Marvin delivered a scathing confessional masterpiece, an open wound set to music. He sang about betrayal, resentment, lost tenderness, and spiritual fatigue. Critics were baffled. Fans were shocked. But Marvin didn't care. He had nothing left to prove, only things left to say. Haunted by IRS debts, paranoia, and addiction, Marvin left America in 1980 and moved to Belgium. There, away from the industry, the tabloids, and the expectations, he found peace, however fleeting. He jogged along cobbled streets, ate quietly at local cafes, went to church. He also began writing again new music more honest than ever. In 1982, he returned to the U.S. with Midnight Love and its electrifying lead single Sexual Healing. It was a comeback in every sense. The song topped charts around the world. Marvin won 2 Grammys. He performed at the NBA All-Star Game, dazzling crowds with his lush gospel-style rendition of the national anthem. But his demons were never far behind. The fame returned. So did the addiction, the restlessness, the trauma he had carried since childhood beatings from his father, losses of friends. The guilt of surviving still throbbed beneath his brilliant smile. From 1962 to 1984, Marvin Gaye amassed a staggering legacy, 30 top 40 hits, genre-defining albums, and a cultural presence that transcended generations. He could make you dance, cry, question, or pray sometimes, all in one song. But more than stats or awards, Marvin's rise to fame was defined by how relentlessly he chose truth over performance. He never wanted to be perfect. He just wanted to be real. And in doing so, he created a blueprint not just for black artists, but for anyone daring to live fully, to feel deeply, and to sing without shame. By the early 1980s, Marvin Gaye stood at the edge of legend and collapse. His legacy as the Prince of Soul was secure, But beneath the surface, the man who once redefined black music with What's Going On and seduced the world with Let's Get It On was slowly unraveling. He had spent decades bearing his soul in song, but behind the studio glass a storm raged, one made of addiction, paranoia, shattered relationships, and a haunting prophecy that his own life would end violently. The truth, Marvin wasn't just battling the music industry. He was at war with himself. Fame never truly soothed Marvin's pain, it only dressed it in sequins. By the late 1970s, the same man who once pleaded for peace in What's Going On had become reclusive, volatile, and increasingly paranoid. Cocaine became his companion, blurring the edges of reality. His behavior grew erratic. Friends described him as either deeply spiritual or disturbingly detached, sometimes in the same day. Marvin believed people were trying to kill him. He often wore a bulletproof vest on stage. He moved homes frequently. He kept weapons nearby and installed surveillance equipment in his bedrooms. During one particularly delusional episode, he told his entourage he believed the mafia was following him and that shadowy figures were watching him from helicopters. His relationship with women also became fraught with mistrust and fear. After a messy divorce from Anna Gordy, Marvin married Janice Hunter in 1977, a woman 17 years his junior. Their relationship was tempestuous, fueled by passion, jealousy, and emotional volatility. Janice later recounted episodes of extreme paranoia, verbal outbursts, and long disappearances. Their marriage crumbled under the weight of Marvin's demons. And yet, amidst the chaos, Marvin produced some of his most hauntingly beautiful music. Albums like Hear My Dear read like diary entries carved into vinyl, truthful, unfiltered, painful. But truth alone couldn't save him. By 1980, Marvin owed the IRS nearly $5 million. He was broke, addicted, and disillusioned. Seeking both spiritual and financial refuge, he fled to Europe, eventually settling in Ostend, Belgium. There, for the first time in years, he found a fragile sense of peace. Locals described him as soft-spoken, generous, and deeply reflective. He walked alone on the beach, attended church, and even coached a local youth soccer team. He also began working on a new kind of sound, combining his sensual instincts with emerging synth and funk elements. That period gave birth to Midnight Love 1982, an album that restored him to stardom. Its lead single, Sexual Healing, wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. The track hit #1 on the R&B chart, earned him 2 Grammys, and reintroduced Marvin Gaye to a new generation of listeners. But Europe was a bandage, not a cure. Marvin's inner torment followed him across oceans. And he soon returned to America, to the very house where his darkest fears would become reality. In 1983, Marvin moved back into his parents' home in Los Angeles. He had purchased it years earlier for them, a large 2-story house on South Gramercy Place. But to Marvin, it wasn't a home, it was the birthplace of his pain. Living under the same roof as his father, Reverend Marvin Gaye Sr., reopened old scars. The abuse Marvin endured as a child was never forgotten. The whippings, the judgment, the confusion of a cross-dressing father who preached fire and brimstone by day and humiliated him by night. The tension was immediate, suffocating, and violent. Marvin had grown into a global icon, but in that house, he was still a bruised son, desperate for love and haunted by a man who never gave it. They fought often, screamed through walls. His mother, Alberta, tried to keep the peace, but even she knew something dark was looming. Marvin became increasingly depressed and paranoid again. He rarely left the house. He kept a revolver nearby. And when asked by a friend what he feared most, he answered quietly, "My father. One day he'll kill me." He wasn't wrong. The final day began like any other tension. Silence, a storm waiting to break. Marvin was in his bedroom when he overheard his father yelling at Alberta. As had happened too many times before, Marvin intervened. He shouted. They argued. He shoved his father. Later that afternoon, Marvin sat in his bedroom drained. His mother later said he seemed distant, tired in a way she'd never seen. Moments later, his father entered the room carrying the .38 caliber pistol Marvin had given him for protection months earlier. Without hesitation, Marvin Gaye Sr. raised the gun and fired. The bullet tore through Marvin's chest, piercing his heart. Alberta screamed. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. At 44 years old, the voice of a generation, the man who once sang to heal a nation, was silenced by the very person who had wounded him most. The next day was Marvin's birthday. The world was stunned. Mourning swept across cities. Radio stations played What's Going On repeat. Fans flooded the streets. Politicians, artists, and fellow musicians paid tribute to a man who had given everything to his craft and left behind a void too vast to fill. Marvin Gaye Sr. was arrested, but received a suspended sentence citing voluntary manslaughter and health issues. He served no prison time, a fact that infuriated many who believed Marvin had been failed not just by his father, but by a system that never truly understood his pain. The house was eventually sold. The bullet hole in the wall was patched. But Marvin's ghost never left. His story was not one of mere tragedy, but of prophecy fulfilled, an artist so sensitive, so attuned to the pain of the world that he couldn't escape his own. In his final interviews, Marvin often spoke of being tired, not of music, but of life, of being misunderstood, of having to filter every raw emotion into palatable art. He feared losing his mind. He feared becoming a puppet. He feared that even his most profound work would be reduced to catchy hooks and romantic nostalgia. He once said, "If you're not allowed to speak the truth through your music, then what's the point of singing?" Marvin Gaye's hidden truth was that he wasn't just a singer. He was a vessel of sorrow, protest, love, and divinity. And that weight. It was too much for one man to carry. They say legends never die, but some are forced to live through pain so deep, so unforgiving, that death feels more like silence than tragedy. Marvin Gaye didn't just create music. He created confessions, hymns, cries for justice wrapped in velvet harmonies. He gave the world a voice for love, a language for suffering, a heartbeat for every unheard prayer. But behind that voice was a man desperately searching for peace, for understanding, for someone to simply let him be. He was called brilliant, difficult, spiritual, unstable genius, unpredictable, because the world never knew how to hold a soul like Marvin's, one that didn't fit in the industry's mold, one that didn't bow to labels or formulas, one that refused to sing just to please. His death wasn't the final note. It was the punctuation to a lifetime of pushing boundaries, of saying no to conformity, of choosing soul over safety. He stood in studios with legends like Diana Ross and David Ruffin, not as a rival, but as a mirror they often couldn't face. He walked away from Quincy Jones, not out of arrogance, but because he valued chaos, freedom, truth, more than polish. He even defied Berry Gordy, not to destroy Motown, but to remind it what soul was born to be. And in the end, it was that same courage, raw, sacred, and sometimes self-destructive, that cost him everything. But here's the truth. Marvin Gaye won. He won because he sang what others were too afraid to feel. He asked questions when silence was easier. He told the truth when the world begged for fantasy. And in doing so, he made music that will outlive every record label, every chart position, and every forgotten award show. Today, you hear Marvin in every artist who dares to be vulnerable, in every song that chooses message over marketing, in every black voice that sings not to entertain, but to be heard. Have you really listened to what's going on? Not just heard it, but felt it. Do you still think fame is freedom? Or are you ready to finally hear the story behind the sound? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you believe Marvin Gaye really was? Icon, rebel, prophet, or something else entirely? And if this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. Because here at Legends of Black Excellence, we don't just tell stories. We uncover legacies raw, real, and unapologetically black. The next voice we honor might be the one you've never truly heard until now.